White fur can be a challenging thing to draw, especially on white paper. The most important thing to not do is to just colour it in with a white coloured pencil and call it a day. And if white fur is something you struggle with, then I have some tips and techniques to help improve your drawings of white fur, including colours I use and my process of tackling it. Hi everyone, I'm Ceira, a pet and animal portrait artist, and today I'm going to talk to you about the topic of tackling white fur. So I'm going to get straight into it with tip number 1. So my first tip to you is that white fur isn't actually white. So going back to basics of lighting, I'm sure we've all heard that to produce the quote-unquote white colour of light, it's actually just a mixture of all the colours combined. So I find this can kind of be related to drawing white fur, in the sense that it's not actually white. Like I said before, if you just use a white colour pencil, then you're not going to get the result you're hoping for. White fur tends to reflect the colours in which it is surrounded. I find that quite often the case is that the fur has a slightly blue tinge to it. For this, I really recommend glazing or adding extremely lightly a blue somewhere in your layers. My favourite colours for this include the Faber-Castell Polychromo in the shade Sky Blue, or the Caran d'Ache Luminance Light Cobalt Blue. If it's a warmer blue you need, then the Faber-Castell Polychromo Light Cobalt Turquoise would be the one I recommend. Remember to never add these in heavy-handed, always light pressure. Another useful colour is the Derwent Lightfast Arctic. As you can see, this colour looks almost white, but it's not. It's actually got a slight blue tinge to it, more so than the Polychromo Cold Grey range, and so I'll use this to blend out finer layers in colder areas, particularly where the blue isn't incredibly obvious. Oftentimes the colour being reflected isn't always blue. Quite often I find it can also be green, and for this I'll use the Polychromo Earth Green. Here are a couple more colours I find myself reaching for often whenever I'm drawing white fur to add a tinge of other colour to it. This would be my most recommended tip to you, as when I started adding more colours to my white fur, not just leaving it white, is when I noticed the biggest improvement in my pieces with white fur. My second tip, cold and warm. Now this tip kind of works off the back of my first, but I felt it deserved its own section. So most times white fur will have a slightly warm or slightly cold feel about it. The best way to recognise this is the cooler areas looking more blue, and the warmer areas seem to lean a bit more yellow. Here's 2 examples. This piece of white fur leans very warm, and this piece of white fur leans very cold. In the Polychromo range there are some beautiful greys, labelled as cold and labelled as warm, which you can use the corresponding warmness and coldness in areas that you need. The Polychromo Warm Grey too is particularly useful in adding warmness in areas in light fur, without it being too overpowering. Using warm and cold greys will provide more interest in those areas of white fur, helping them to not look so flat. Next up, for tip 3, is adding darkness to the white fur. So even though the fur is white, it's still really important that you're paying close attention to the shadows and highlights. For example, this piece of fur is white, however it has a shadowed area, therefore it's still important that you add the area of shadow in with some darker greys, otherwise the piece will kind of lack a bit of depth and it will look quite flat. So I always find it helpful to remember the phrase, draw what you see and not what you think you see, because although the fur is white in the areas, it's darker in those shadows. So tip number 4 is particularly focused on longer white fur. So this tip is mainly focused when you're drawing longer sections of white fur, such as on this piece I'm working on here. It involves the use of the Tombow Mono Eraser. This can also be used to imply the different layers of fur, and it is particularly useful to take out the highlights in white fur. Using it in the long motions also helps to create the essence of longer fur. I like it for the white fur as it makes it easy to add subtle texture considering the paper I'm using is white, so the highlights created are also of a white tone. Now we're going to move on to how I tackle white fur. Firstly, when I'm drawing white fur, the thing I always like to do first, no matter my subject, is map out a fur direction using a sharp Polychromo Cold Grey one. When it comes to drawing white fur, this is my most used pencil. It's just dark enough to be able to see it against the white paper and creates white without actually using a white colour pencil. I find that usually the Cold Grey one is actually the lightest I have to go in drawings containing white fur and is usually the colour of the highlights. My next step of action is adding Polychromo Cold Grey 2 and 3 into the more shadowy areas, then using a Warm Grey 2 over the shadowy areas that are more warm toned. It's at this point I like to go in and start adding all of the colour very lightly into the portrait, including my blues, greens, purples and pinks, and many more, as many as I can see really. I also find that now is the time to start taking out areas with the Tombow Mono eraser if I feel I need to. I'll also go in with my Warm Grey 1 and Cold Grey 1 polychromos to blend out even more of the colours I've just added in. I repeat all of these processes until I'm happy with the amount added, also adding areas of darker grey if needed. I also like to use the Polychrome Cold Grey 2 at this point. I use it quite sharp and I just use it to add some fur texture and to imply the darkness in between pieces of hair in the lighter areas of the fur. Occasionally I'll use some white in lighter areas to add highlight or just in general to blend graininess. The 3 white coloured pencils I have and recommend for any drawing of any colour animal are the Faber-Castell Polychromo White, the Caran d'Ache Luminance White and the Caran d'Ache Museum Aquarelle White, in order from the least to most opaque. The Polychromo and Luminance White are better for blending depending on what you are trying to blend, and the Museum Aquarelle White is the most useful for adding white in over the top of something you've already drawn. I particularly like this specific colour pencil for going in and adding whiskers over the top. So that's usually the process I take whenever I'm drawing white fur, and I use quite a similar process for many different fur types and colours that I draw. Anyway, I hope that some of my tips were useful to you and help you to improve your drawings of white fur. Thank you so much for joining me in this video, and if there are any other types of fur you'd like me to create a tips video on, then just let me know in the comment section below. Thanks for watching everyone, have a lovely day, bye!